Hello and welcome. I'm Kip Davis, a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and still obsessed with apologetics videos on YouTube. This is the second of 3 response videos to a presentation by Michael Jones of Inspriring Philosophy on the Capturing Christianity channel titled The Reliability of Genesis 1-11. In the first video, I showed how a catalog of errors in Jones's talk essentially invalidate his overarching premises. That the biblical book of Genesis is internally consistent, and that Genesis as a whole was written as early as the Bronze Age. If you have not yet already seen it, then you may want to go back and click on the link to watch it before stepping into this second part. I would encourage you also to take the time to view Jones's video in its entirety to ensure that I am not misrepresenting his inventory of tedious points. In this video, I will be returning to my professional roots in post-Babylonian manuscripts and artifacts as a means to show how Jones has created a false dichotomy in order to make his case by positing only 2 options for the dating of Genesis, either in the Bronze Age or in the post-exilic period. In so doing, he completely sidesteps the numerous issues of internal consistency within the text that rather clearly show stages of development over a much longer period of time. I will also argue that Jones is guilty of forging a number of straw man positions about the construction of Genesis and the nature of its sources. So let's begin. Jones makes a few arguments for a Bronze Age date of Genesis on the basis of language. In his treatment of the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, he points to the appearance of Akkadian and Ugaritic place names, and then later also makes a point about the existence of Akkadian cognates and the place name Havilah for modern Arabia as indicators that the text properly belongs in the 2nd millennium BCE.
It was written late. A lot of very, very liberal scholars will say that Genesis was written 3rd century BC, I've heard. This is after the exile. I've heard Babylonian exile is typically where some people want to place it. Now, that doesn't seem to match what we see at works around that time that have a lot of Aramaic cognates. Genesis seems to have a fair amount of Akkadian cognates.
He goes on to say,
Akkadian wasn't really used much in the later period during the Babylonian exile. It was a language used much more during the Bronze Age. So it seems to reflect that kind of time period. These sort of Akkadian cognates are popping in and out of there.
Jones then qualifies his argument.
To be fair, there might also be some Aramaic cognates as well, and I think that would possibly reflect the idea that when you translate Genesis into the later Chaldean alphabet, you're going to get some of that, but you're not going to get something like what you see in like Enoch or Jubilees, where there are mostly just Aramaic cognates in there. There was no evidence of very early Akkadian cognates in that sense. So early words seem to put it more also stemming from an older tradition in that sense.
As a side note here, the word Chaldean is a loaded term that has passed out of usage in modern biblical scholarship. This is possibly an indication of the date and quality of Jones's sources. But moving beyond that, there is both a significant error at work here, and also a reflection of a frustrating false dichotomy that Jones has developed for his argument. One of the main points in his entire presentation is that either Genesis 1-11 was written in the Middle Bronze Age, which Jones delimits to maybe 1800 to 1500 BCE, or it was written in the Babylonian exile after 587 BCE. In one place he suggests that Genesis was compiled in the reign of David or Solomon, between 1000 to 900 BCE. And even if we grant the maximal late limit, the distance between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE is still 400 years. At no point in his presentation does Jones ever provide for the alternative that Genesis may have been composed in this gap of 4 centuries. The mistake that Jones makes plays into this false dichotomy, since the vast majority of scholars maintain that significant portions of Genesis and the rest of the Torah derive from sources that were written during this 400-year gap. So what then if there are elements within Genesis that derive from a period prior to the Neo-Babylonian Empire? Akkadian was still the lingua franca in the Assyrian Empire until it declined in 600 BCE. Akkadian was still in use all the way until the Hellenistic period. On the face of it, it is true that Akkadian was much more prevalent in the Bronze Age than it was after 500 BCE. However, missing from Jones's rhetoric is any apparent awareness of the fact that Akkadian was the official language of the Assyrians who dominated the ancient Near East in the 9th to 6th centuries BCE. It is completely unsurprising that source material from this period should also contain Akkadian cognates. But Jones would rather have us ignore the actual period in time from which most of Genesis probably originated in favor of a false choice between the Bronze Age and the Babylonian exile. Jones makes the same point for the designation of modern Arabia.
Modern-day Arabia had an earlier name called Havilah. We know when the switch happened in the Bible. In Genesis, it's called Havilah. And then in later texts, it's called Arabia. So Genesis seems to fit with an earlier name for the area. And interestingly enough, if you look in the Bible when the switch happened, it happens around the same time the Queen of Sheba comes up to meet Solomon. So all of a sudden, Solomon is making new trade connections, and they start calling it by a new name, Arabia.
Jones provides 7 texts where the name designation Havilah occurs, and 7 where the region is referred to as Arabia. A much more reliable indicator than biblical texts for when names were in common usage is in the archaeological record, and the earliest epigraphic occurrence of the place designation Havilah is in the Sabaean record of Kareb-il-Vatar, who ruled the Himyarite kingdom in the 7th century BCE. A much more sensible approach to history, then, is to take the physical data that we have on hand and to align significantly later manuscript evidence with it, and not the other way around. Of course, any discussion about language in Genesis would be incomplete without touching on the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, 1-9.
The problem is that Babylon didn't become a major city until about the time of Abraham. So this is a big problem for the Tower of Babel, because how could it be Babylon if Babylon did not come in existence until when Abraham was around? It talks about it existing before Abraham sometime in the past. However, the city of Eridu was often identified with Babylon.
So Jones is attempting to provide a setting for this story in the Bronze Age by connecting it very loosely to specific historical circumstances from before the early 2nd millennium BCE and tying it to another city altogether.
So what happens is when Eridu was abandoned, the traditions of Eridu were then later became the traditions of Babylon. So Eridu was sort of seen as the old Babylon, and Babylon was sort of seen as like the new Eridu in that kind of sense. So Eridu was basically a thriving city from these time periods. It was intermediately abandoned a lot. I'll get to that in a second, though. But first, let's talk about some correlations in the text. Okay, Eridu is referred to as a Babylon, having the same toponym. Genesis says it was a city of Babel. Built after a migration. So this is when the Proto-Sumerians are moving in. And Genesis 11 might hint to that about people moving to the land of Shinar. They sort of happened when the Proto-Sumerians are sort of moving in. Urbanization starts to peak, and this is around the Uruk period. Eridu has a ziggurat made of fired bricks. That's what Genesis 3 also mentions, Genesis 11 verse 3 mentions. And then Akkadian and Sumerian texts, there's similar language about ziggurats, what we see in Genesis 11. So they talk about their ziggurats having its tops in the heavens. Well, Genesis 11:4 uses the same language. And it's meant to bring the gods down.
He rightly notes the problem of dating Babylon to before the period of the patriarchs, which is why he must insert another city altogether, Eridu in this case. However, this is only a problem for literalists who require perfect accuracy throughout the biblical record. It is no problem whatsoever from a critical perspective to posit that the account is simply historically inaccurate. Moreover, the existence of a good deal of considerably later supporting evidence for a post-exilic setting of the Tower of Babel story also mitigates quite strongly against the Bronze Age date that Jones hopes to assign to it, and provides for a different purpose altogether for the Tower of Babel story. When I was working on the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in the Scaean collection, I had the chance also to see this rather remarkable artifact, the so-called Tower of Babel stele, which rather bolsters the ahistoricity of Genesis 11 and provides for a stronger likelihood that the story was originally a parody and ideological critique of the activities of Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE. The stele was erected to celebrate Nebuchadnezzar's extensive renovation of the ancient ziggurat in Babylon, which might have been originally constructed in the Bronze Age, perhaps even by Hammurabi himself. The text which accompanies the visage of Nebuchadnezzar on the stele reads in part, "Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon am I. In order to complete Itemen Anki and Urmi Imen Anki, I mobilized all countries everywhere, each and every ruler who had been raised to prominence over all the people of the world. Loved by Marduk, from the upper sea to the lower sea, the distant nations, the teeming people of the world, kings of remote mountains and far-flung islands. The base I filled in to make a high terrace. I built their structures with bitumen and baked brick throughout. I completed it, raising its top to the heaven, making it gleam bright as the sun." In this context, the story in Genesis functions as a thinly veiled critique of the audacious actions of King Nebuchadnezzar, the arrogant man who conquered the whole world, attempted to conscript the nations for the construction of a city and a tower as a tribute to his own conceited pride. Jones returns to the fertile ground of the Table of Nations to make a rather feeble point about the identity of Nimrod from Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 to 12.
A more scholarly approach to Nimrod is what I'll give you here. Nimrod basically means to rebel. It comes from that root word there, and this comes from Douglas Petrovich. So it's sort of like a slang term. It's like saying that rebellious one. It may not be his actual name. It might just be a slang term for him. So, bad nickname in that sense. So, what do we know about him? Well, he was a descendant from Cush. He was called a mighty man. He was a hunter or a slaughterer. Starts in the land of Sumer, which is Shinar in the Bible, and conquers the region of Assyria. Now, this fits with someone's particularly. It fits with a guy called Sargon of Akkad. He descended from a city called Kish. He became a powerful emperor. Lugal, a Sumerian word for king, means big man. So it could reflect the mighty man in Genesis 10. Killed many to build his empire, and starts in the land of Sumer, and then conquers the region of Assyria. So Petrovich argues that what they're talking about in Genesis 10 is just Sargon of Akkad. And that would also fit with an early Bronze Age time period, not a later Iron Age time period.
Most scholars would agree that identifying the historical Nimrod is futile. The consensus is rather that the personage is with reference either to a legendary god-king or an historical figure whose name is an abbreviation formed from the Babylonian god Marduk and the Assyrian god Ninurta. And if this were the case, then certainly Sargon of Akkad is a good candidate. However, more problematically for Jones, is the attempt to locate the text by association of Nimrod's activities with an early Bronze Age period, Again, he makes this argument by providing for only one alternative, that this was rather written closer to the Babylonian exile, and ignores entirely the hundreds of years gap between the Bronze Age and the 6th century BCE. The significant problem with this idea is how much more comfortably the entire passage in Genesis chapter 10 verses 8 to 12 fits within an 8th century milieu. The figure Nimrod is readily identified by the 8th, 7th century prophet Micah with the land of Assyria in Micah 5:5. More particularly, the hunting imagery attached to Nimrod from the word tzayid, which cannot be translated as slaughterer, is entirely resonant with Neo-Assyrian tradition of the mid-first millennium, and not at all with the old Assyrian kingdom. This would mean that an 8th to 6th century date is to be preferred. Most prominently, the place locations Nineveh, Calah, and Rezin all reflect a Neo-Assyrian setting. Genesis 10:12 calls Calah the great city. While Calah was founded in the 13th century BCE, it did not become a major center in the Assyrian Empire until its restoration by Assur-Nasir-Pal II in the 9th century. Rezin, in this same verse, most likely refers collectively to the canals or aqueducts, which were part of ambitious building programs by Assur-Nasir-Pal II, Esarhaddon, and Sennacherib in the 9th through 7th centuries. Most likely the Pati Helgi near Calah, and the canal system around Nineveh. Finally, verse 11 mentions Rehoboth Ir, which would equate in Akkadian to the great plaza of the city and refers to the Rebit Ninwa, that is the famous court in the palace without rival constructed by the 8th, 7th century Assyrian king Sennacherib. So in the end, this attempt to locate the historical Nimrod is all for naught, since these other features rather clearly demonstrate a concern with mid-first millennium Neo-Assyrian geopolitical affairs. Had Jones bothered to even consider an Iron Age dating for the text, then I don't see how he could have missed these crucial indicators. Another thing that Jones does to make his case is to take an all-or-nothing approach to the subject of the overlap between biblical texts and ancient Near Eastern myths, and to theories about the development of monotheism.
Now, skeptics will say that Genesis was sort of just plagiarized from these polytheistic myths during the Babylonian exile. So when the Jews were in exile, they took things like the Atrahasis or Gilgamesh, and they just took the parts they liked, and they made a monotheistic version of them all.
He uses this sort of false dichotomy as a way to posit a straw man of scholarly theories about the construction of Genesis, and then easily topples them. Jones supplies a quote from James Hoffmeyer a few times to make this point.
If the movement towards monotheism occurred during the Babylonian captivity, it seems counterintuitive to take the polytheistic mythic literature of Babylon and place it into the Hebrew monotheistic writings. In other words, if you're becoming a monotheist or if you're advocating strict monotheism, why would you use polytheistic texts when that's supposed to be utter heresy? That's detestable to God. That just doesn't seem likely.
So, for Jones, either the ancient Hebrews were always monotheists, or these ideals first emerged in contravention to polytheism that was encountered during the exile in Babylon. Developing on this point, by way of the Genesis flood stories, he quotes from French Assyriologist Jean Bottero.
Back to the idea that, they were just plagiarizing the Atrahasis, or they were just plagiarizing Gilgamesh. Jean Bottero says, though the more than substantial identity with the Babylonian flood is not in the least doubt, there are too many divergent details between the two for the account of Genesis to be regarded simply as a transcript into Hebrew of the Akkadian text of Atrahasis or Gilgamesh.
Jones then quotes from Japanese Bible scholar David Toshio Tsumura, about the Genesis creation stories.
Genesis 1 and Enuma Elish, which was composed primarily to exalt Marduk in the pantheon of Babylon, have no direct relation to each other. It is not correct to say that Enuma Elish was adopted and adapted by the Israelites to produce the Genesis stories. As Lambert holds, there is no evidence of Hebrew borrowing from Babylon.
Either the ancient Hebrews possessed an independent national history and cosmology, or they plagiarized a monotheistic version of polytheistic creation myths during the exile.
It just doesn't seem likely that they would sort of be putting this history together to sort of plagiarize polytheistic myths during the Babylonian exile. I would say a lot of this data, and this argument from a priori basically, is that if you're going to be in exile and you're supposed to be becoming monotheistic during this time period, why are you plagiarizing these polytheistic myths? You would probably want to reflect your own history and whatnot and collect that and get that kind of idea together, instead of stealing from the people you are claiming are heretics and evil and are preaching false religions. It doesn't seem to make much sense there.
Of course, there is a huge field of alternative options that exist in this sharp dichotomy between options that Jones would have us to consider. The Genesis creation and flood myths were not transcribed out of whole cloth from other ancient Near Eastern creation myths, but they were also not completely independent creations. The truth of the matter is that many similar ideas to what we read in the Enuma Elish were also circulating in traditions that were eventually nailed down in Genesis 1. In other words, they are comparatively similar, and I think this actually makes logical sense that upon arriving in Babylon during the exile, the Hebrews demythologized their own texts in an effort to provide ideological competition with Babylonian creation stories. For example, the priestly creation myth in Genesis 1 is a contemporized version, which echoes imagery and themes within the Enuma Elish, but transformed so as to clearly distinguish it. According to Harvard professor Michael Coogan, the first account of creation in Genesis both employs and alludes to mythical concepts and phrasing, but at the same time, it also adapts, transforms, and rejects them. It's not that the Hebrew stories are borrowing so much as they are countering, and this is actually a point that Jones makes elsewhere in the video. In addition, a careful appraisal of the Hebrew texts themselves shows a distinct progression from polytheism towards monotheism. We see evidence of this development throughout the biblical text. For example, the uncorrupted text of Deuteronomy 32, 8-12 retains an obvious reflection of a polytheistic worldview. We know about the historical development of this passage from the 2nd or 3rd century Greek translation in the Septuagint, and also from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a fragment of 4Q Deuteronomy J, which contains the passage in question. 4Q Deuteronomy J dates from the mid-1st century BCE, and while it is not the oldest manuscript copy of the Book of Deuteronomy, it does retain the earliest physical evidence of this crucial reading. In the passage, the chief god of the region, El Elyon, is pictured dividing the territory amongst the council of gods. When Elyon apportioned the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people according to the sons of the gods. In the following verse, Israel's tribal deity Yahweh is distinguished from the chief god Elyon. Thus, Yahweh's portion is his people Jacob, the region of his hereditary property. There is an obvious problem for both monotheism and the insistence on the exclusivity of Yahweh's divinity in this passage, and we can trace how Jewish scribes handled the matter. In the Septuagint, the Greek translator rendered the Hebrew construction B'nai Elohim, the sons of the gods, into Angelon Theo, the angels of God. By the time of the Hellenistic period, it had become commonplace to reimagine the lower members of the Canaanite pantheon as angels, and not actual gods, as they were clearly presented in texts such as this, and in others like in Genesis 6, Job 1, and various Psalms. The form of this passage that most are familiar with appears in the Masoretic text. This is the version of the Hebrew Bible that the post-temple rabbinic Jews adopted as their standard text. Parts of the Masoretic text were clearly already in circulation since before the 2nd century BCE, but the oldest manuscript copies stem from after the 3rd century. The Masoretic text rendition of this problematic passage was to change B'nai Elohim, the sons of the gods, to B'nai Yisrael, thus rendering the sense of this etiology into nonsense. When Elyon apportioned the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people according to the sons of Israel. For Yahweh's portion is his people Jacob, the region of his hereditary property. Thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls and to the Septuagint, we see a clear line of development from polytheistic Israel, where the tribal god Yahweh was a member of El Elyon's council of deities, to the Septuagint, where the council was replaced by angels, to the Masoretic text, where the angels were omitted entirely. But there is more. This fragment, 4Q Deuteronomy Q, dates to the mid-1st century BCE, and, like 4Q Deuteronomy J, survives as the oldest copy of Deuteronomy 32, but preserving only verses 41 to 43, and these look different from our biblical texts. A lot different. The English translation most of us are accustomed to is derived from the later Masoretic text, which has eliminated and changed critical portions of the passage. The Masoretic text reads, "Sing praises nations for his people. For the blood of his servants he will avenge. He will wreak vengeance on his enemies and cleanse the land of his people." The altered portions are highlighted in red. From the earlier text, a stanza is missing. "Bow down to him, all you gods." The following line has been changed from Yahweh's vengeance on behalf of his sons to his servants, thus glossing over a polytheistic view of the divine council. There is another missing stanza appearing at the end of the passage. "He will repay those who hate him." The reasons for these changes is rather obvious from both clear perspectives of the development of monotheistic ideals in Israelite and later Jewish religion, and of the nature of Hebrew poetry. The original form of the passage is in 3 pairs of parallel statements. "Praise, O heavens, his people. Bow down before him, all you gods. For he will avenge the blood of his sons and take vengeance on his adversaries. He will repay those who hate him and cleanse his people's land." For a later editor, the polytheistic essence of the second stanza prompted its omission, and the alteration of the object in the third stanza from blood of his sons to blood of his servants. But these changes then also created an uneven poetic structure. By also eliminating the 5th stanza, the entire poetical structure is improved and also changed into a chiastic grouping of 4 lines featuring people, vengeance, vengeance, and people. So it is clear from the manuscript evidence that monotheism is something that did in fact develop within early Judaism over time, and that latent forms of polytheism continued to persist. There is still more evidence of this within the text of the Hebrew Bible. Fragments of alternative creation myths in Psalms and in Job retain a view of cosmic battle between God and the divine forces of chaos. "O God, my King from of old, who brings deliverance throughout the land. It was you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan, who left him as food for the denizens of the desert. It was you who released springs and torrents, who made the mighty rivers run dry. The day is yours, the night also. It was you who set in place the orb of the sun. You fixed all the boundaries of the earth, summer and winter. You made them. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak, if you have understanding. Do you know who fixed its dimensions, or who measured it with a line? Onto what were its bases sunk? Who set its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of the gods shouted for joy. Who closed the sea behind doors when it gushed forth out of the womb? When I clothed it with clouds, swaddled it in dense clouds. When I made breakers, my limit for it, and set up its bars and doors, and said, you may come so far and no farther. Here your surging waves will stop. Despite a good post-exilic monotheistic scrubbing, there is still a plurality of deities in Genesis 1:26. And the gods said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And in 3:22, Yahweh God said, now that the man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad. In Genesis 6:1-4, when man began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of the gods saw how beautiful the daughters of men were and took wives from among those that pleased them. It was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared in the earth, when the sons of the gods cohabited with the daughters of men who bore them offspring. And in Genesis 11:7, and Yahweh said, let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech. Clear evidence of a vestigial polytheism that already existed within these texts from the start. There are obvious similar elements that remain in the Hebrew myths with their ancient Near Eastern counterparts, and this is unsurprising. Over the course of time, these stories became less and less like the polytheistic myths of their neighbors, as the Israelite aristocracy and temple establishment became progressively more henotheistic or exclusively monotheistic, and we can trace these developments through the texts. The Hebrew myths already bore resemblances to the Babylonian, the Sumerian, and the Akkadian myths of their neighbors before the Jews arrived in Babylon. If anything, the exile probably helped to reshape existing traditions into texts more explicitly monotheistic. This certainly would serve to explain why a later redactor fudged the text of Deuteronomy 32:8 to toe the new party line. I think it is abundantly clear from this discussion that Michael Jones's tactics for arguing the supposed antiquity and cohesion of the book of Genesis are duplicitous. By removing any potential middle ground between dates in the Bronze Age and the Babylonian period, and by structuring a case that must be committed to either a position of total independence or dependence on culturally contemporary other source materials. These are impossible positions to defend, and they detract from the real issues which have convinced scholars about the compositional history of Genesis. The reason why we hold to source theories is because the sources themselves are so readily and abundantly identifiable within the text. The reason why we tend to temporarily situate Genesis in the post-exilic is because all indications point with laser focus to this period as the point in time in which the Pentateuch as we know it achieved its first recognizable form. These points are beyond dispute, and the attempts like Jones's video to dispute them stems from either an extremely poor understanding of the documentary hypothesis, which is the standard theory of the formation of the Pentateuch, or he is deliberately misrepresenting it as a means to bolster his case. A common feature of evangelical apologetics is to garble the source theories, which prompts me to more thoroughly and clearly present the documentary hypothesis and the mountains of evidence for it. This will be the topic of the final video of the series. Until then,